January 12, 1854, Louisiana Bayou country. The morning mist rolled thick over the cane fields, low and heavy, the kind that clung to skin like sweat. The crows were awake before the men. The frogs croaked in the ditches where swamp water sat still, black and humming. The sugar kettles still smoldered from the night's boiling sweet smoke rising into the air. And on that plantation, Beaufort Plantation, it smelled of iron, cane juice, ash, and misery. Hannah, that was her name. 29 years old, born into chains, raised in silence. They tried to make her small, but her body betrayed them. Tall, broad-shouldered, strong in the arms from years of hauling, stirring, lifting. Her palms were thick with callus, her skin darkened from sun and scar. She did not cry, she just worked. The Beaufort Plantation was run by men who believed themselves gods. The master, Colonel Augustus Beaufort, rarely dirtied his own hands. He left the daily cruelties to his 8 overseers, Mr. Clayton, Mr. Harrow, Joel, Seth, Turner, Elias, Robert, and James. 8 names that lived on the lips of every slave in whispered curses. 8 men who cracked whips and laughed while doing it. 8 men who owned the dawn, or thought they did. At dawn, the whip snapped. At dawn, the orders fell. At dawn, silence was demanded, but dawn was watching Hannah. Her mornings began before the bell. She woke in a wooden cabin, walls thin enough to hear the rats scratching. The floor was dirt, uneven, packed by feet that shuffled back and forth in fear. Her bed was straw, damp with the cold of the Louisiana winter. She slept curled around her niece Ruth, only 7, thin as a reed, who sometimes cried in her sleep but always muffled the sound. Crying meant questions. Questions meant punishment. The bell rang at 5. The cabin stirred. Feet hit the earth. Women pulled cloth around their shoulders. Men tightened belts around waists lean from hunger. Children were shaken awake. The overseers wanted them in the fields as the first light broke. Hannah rose. She braided Ruth's hair quickly, pulling tight, whispering, "Be still." Her hands were rough, but her voice was low, steady. Then she took her place among the others. They walked in silence to the fields, the air cold, the mud clinging. The overseers rode horses, leather boots shining even in the dim light. The sound of hooves in the dirt was the morning drum. Mr. Clayton barked orders. He was tall, pale-faced, with a red scar on his jaw where a knife had once grazed him in some long-ago tavern fight. He liked to remind the slaves of that scar, spinning tales of how many men he had cut down. Joel, younger, meaner, carried his whip like a toy. He liked to test it on children, cracking it near their ears just to see them flinch. Seth was slow, his cruelty measured. He enjoyed stretching punishment out, savoring screams. Turner drank before sunrise. Elias never spoke except to curse. Robert collected coins for betting games played on who would break first under lash. And James. James was the one who smiled while he hurt you. Hannah knew their rhythms. She had studied them longer than they had noticed her. She knew which horse Clayton favored, which flask Turner hid, which knife Seth kept tucked in his boot. She knew their footsteps, their shadows, their laughs. She remembered every word they had ever spat at her. Her days were endless motion, hauling cane stalks taller than her, dumping them into wagons, dragging those wagons to the mill. She stirred kettles of boiling cane juice until her skin blistered from the steam. She carried water to the field hands, lifted sacks that bent her spine, chopped wood until her arms trembled. She did not cry, she just worked. At night her body shook from exhaustion, but her mind did not rest. She remembered, always remembered, names whispered in the dark. Samuel, her brother, whipped until he never stood again. Mary, her sister, sold to a trader headed west. Little Ruth's mother vanished downriver, never seen again. Each name was a ghost, each ghost a weight pressing on Hannah's chest. The overseers called it discipline, but it was really hunger. Hunger for power, for control, for the sound of breaking. They called it order, but it was really chaos stitched with chains. Hannah moved through this world like shadow. She kept her eyes down, her words soft. But inside she measured, she weighed, she counted. The plantation was alive with sound. Dogs barked, whips cracked, the mill creaked, the fields rustled. But Hannah's silence was sharper. Her silence cut through everything. When others cried, she stayed still. When others prayed aloud, she prayed only in the beat of her pulse. The other slaves saw her as strong. The overseers saw her as useful. No one saw her as dangerous. That was their mistake. On that winter morning of 1854, frost clung to the cane. Breath hung in the air like smoke. The overseers laughed at the slaves shivering in thin cloth. Clayton shouted, "Work faster or you'll feel the whip." Joel cracked his lash in the air, the sound slicing the mist. Hannah stood still for a heartbeat, just one, and in that pause something shifted inside her. She wasn't born with chains. Chains were given. Chains could be returned. Dawn belonged to Hannah now. They said she was born to the plantation, as though chains were a cradle, as though fields were her inheritance. But Hannah knew better. No one was born to chains. Chains were given, forced, hammered onto wrists, onto ankles, onto the soul. Her mother's name was Dinah. Dinah was strong, with hair thick as rope and eyes that never lowered even when whips cracked. Dinah carried Hannah into this world in a cabin that smelled of dirt and wood smoke. The overseer Harrow had burst in on the birth, laughing, spitting tobacco juice onto the floorboards, sneering that another field hand had been born. That was the first sound Hannah ever heard, her mother's scream of pain, his laughter like broken glass. Dinah raised her with hands that never stopped working. She sang in whispers, lullabies drowned by the hum of cicadas, the drone of mosquitoes. Her songs carried warnings. Never look them in the eye, never let them see your tears, never forget who you are. But when Hannah was 8, Dinah was taken. Sold to a trader bound for New Orleans, Hannah remembered that day with unbearable clarity. The wagon wheels crunching, the iron collar around her mother's neck. The way Ruth, then only an infant, cried until she turned purple. Hannah ran, tried to grab her mother's hand, but Mr. Clayton struck her across the face with the back of his hand. She fell, dirt in her mouth, blood in her nose, her mother's voice echoing, "Don't you forget, Hannah. Don't you forget." She never forgot. Her father's name was Josiah. Josiah was tall, quiet, steady like an oak. He taught Hannah how to carry buckets of water without spilling a drop, how to listen to the swamp at night and know where the snakes hid. He told her stories by firelight, stories of freedom, of rivers that led north, of people who could not be broken. But Josiah was broken, not by choice, by whip. One night he refused to work after dark. He said his body had given all it could. Harrow and Joel dragged him into the yard, tied him to the post. The others were forced to watch. 50 lashes, 100. His back tore open, his blood sprayed into the dirt. Hannah stood there, 12 years old, her nails digging into her palms until they bled. He didn't cry. He just groaned until his voice left him. By dawn, Josiah was gone. They buried him in the woods, shallow grave, no marker. But Hannah remembered. She remembered every lash, every name of the men who delivered them. Joel, Harrow, Clayton. Her brother Samuel tried to shield her after that. Samuel was 17, broad like Josiah, reckless with defiance. He whispered of running, of slipping into the swamp at night and following the stars. But Samuel was caught with a stolen map, folded and hidden in his shoe. Turner dragged him out at dawn. The punishment was swift and final. They hanged him from the oak near the fields, left his body swinging as the slaves marched to work. Hannah never forgot the way the wind moved his hair, the silence of his lips. She did not cry. She just remembered. Mary, her younger sister, bright-eyed, soft-voiced, was taken at 15. Sold south. Hannah remembered the day Mary's dress disappeared from the cabin, her laughter gone, her bed empty. She remembered Ruth, Mary's daughter, left behind like a shadow of her mother. Ruth clung to Hannah's skirts every night, whispering, "Auntie, where's Mama?" Hannah had no answer. Only silence. These were the wounds the overseers never saw. They saw a strong back, thick hands, a woman who didn't complain. But inside, Hannah's body was a map of loss. Every scar a memory, every memory a fire. She remembered Elias kicking over the kettle when she was 14, hot syrup splashing up her arm, burning skin to blister. He laughed while she screamed. She remembered Robert wagering coins on how long an old man could carry a sack before collapsing. She remembered James pressing his boot into a boy's neck for stumbling. She remembered Seth dragging a girl into the barn, her cries muffled in the hay, the way no one could stop him. They called it order. But it was really cruelty. They called it discipline. But it was really hunger. Hannah carried these memories like stones in her chest. Each name, each act, each scream stacked higher. And she carried silence too. For silence was safer than speech. But silence was not the same as forgetting. At night, when the plantation slept, she whispered to herself, Not prayers, promises, one for Mama and one for Papa, one for Samuel, one for Mary, one for Ruth's tears. Names became a litany, a rhythm, a drumbeat that kept her alive. And with each whisper, something else grew in her chest. Not hope, not despair, something sharper, something that would not bow. The overseers thought they knew her. They thought her silence meant obedience. They thought her bowed head meant submission. They thought her hands belonged only to labor, her strength only to their fields. They never saw the storm gathering. They never heard the fire crackling in her bones, because Hannah remembered every wound, and she was not done counting. The breaking point is never loud at first. It begins in whispers, in breaths, in the smallest fracture of routine. For Hannah, it began with Ruth's cough. It was the winter of 1853, cold enough that frost crusted the cane stalks, cold enough that the cabins breathed smoke from makeshift fires. Ruth coughed through the nights, her body shaking, ribs rattling, eyes wide with fear. Hannah begged for medicine, just a spoon of molasses mixed with herbs, something to soothe the child. Mr. Clayton laughed. Medicine for her? She'll live or she won't. Plenty more where she came from. Hannah carried Ruth through the night, pressing the girl's chest against her own warmth, whispering her sister Mary's name like a shield. Ruth survived the fever, but something inside Hannah cracked. Not because Ruth almost died, but because Clayton had smiled while saying it didn't matter. The next fracture came days later. Seth dragged a boy, Daniel, barely 12, into the yard. Daniel had stumbled, dropped a sack of cane. Seth made an example, 50 lashes. The sound tore through the air like thunder, Daniel's screams shredding into silence by the 20th strike. Hannah watched. She dug her nails into her palms, blood filling the crescents. She wanted to run, to pull the whip from Seth's hand, to chain it around his throat. But she stood still, not because she was afraid of dying, but because dying too soon would mean nothing. Then came the night Turner staggered drunk through the cabins, his boots stomping, his breath hot with liquor. He dragged a woman out by her hair, one of the field hands named Esther. Hannah heard the cries. She heard the silence after. She sat awake all night, Ruth curled against her side, her jaw clenched until her teeth ached. That silence was the last one. Hannah changed in that silence. She began to move differently, watching, measuring. Her work was still steady, her head still lowered, but her eyes no longer drifted down. They traced the overseers' belts, their whips, their knives. She noticed which chains were hung on hooks in the shed, which barrels of pitch sat by the barn, which ropes were frayed. She memorized every lock, every key, every creak of the iron doors. She didn't cry. She just remembered. The tools of her labor became tools of something else. The chain wasn't for tying wagons. It was for necks, for wrists, for vengeance. The pitch wasn't for sealing barrels. It was for fire, for cleansing, for memory. In the kitchens, she tested weight, how heavy a skillet felt in her hand, how quickly a knife could be hidden in her apron. At the well, she studied reflections, her own eyes hardening, the sky above her gray like steel. And the names returned, stronger. Japa, Dinah, Josiah, Samuel, Mary, Ruth. One for every loss, one for every silence, one for every ghost that lingered in her chest. She did not pray for freedom. She planned for reckoning. The final straw came with James. James, the overseer, who smiled while he hurt. One morning, Ruth stumbled in the field. The ground was still slick from rain, her feet bare, her body weak. James laughed, lifted his whip. Hannah stepped forward faster than thought. She caught Ruth, pulled her upright, shielding her. James's smile widened. "Step aside, woman," he said. But Hannah did not move. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. Her silence wrapped around him like smoke. He raised the whip, but Clayton called him off, impatient for work. The moment passed, but the fire did not. That night, Hannah sat in the cabin, staring at the dirt floor. Ruth slept beside her, breath steady. The moonlight cut through the cracks in the wall, striping her hands in silver. She lifted one hand, flexed the fingers, traced the scars. This was not a hand for carrying. This was not a hand for stirring kettles. This was not a hand for submission. This was a hand for chains. Inside her chest, the fire roared. The breaking point had come. She whispered it to herself, steady, certain. No more silence. No more waiting. No more ghosts without justice. She began to gather, slowly, quietly, a length of chain tucked beneath the straw of her bed. A flask of pitch poured from the barrel when no one watched. Knives hidden in the dirt near the shed. Rope coiled beneath the cabin floor. Each night, she repeated her litany. One for Mama, one for Papa, one for Samuel, one for Mary, one for Ruth. Her silence became her weapon. Her memory became her map. The plantation still woke at dawn. The overseers still barked. The slaves still worked. But Hannah was no longer theirs. She belonged to the fire, and the fire was waiting for dawn. The night of Thanksgiving in 1848 came draped in a heavy stillness. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, corn pudding and pies, drifting from the grand house where overseers and masters gathered for their feast. The sound of laughter and drunken songs rolled across the fields, echoing mockery into the slave quarters. But inside those cramped wooden huts, another kind of silence ruled, one filled with clenched fists pounding hearts and sharpened resolve. Sarah moved among them like a shadow, her eyes burning with the fire of prophecy. She had gathered them all, men, women, even trembling children who were too young to fight but old enough to witness. The poison was ready, hidden in small cloth pouches. The knives were sharpened and the torches prepared. Every step had been calculated, every risk weighed. There would be no turning back. As the feast roared on, Sarah slipped into the kitchen where enslaved women carried trays of food and pitchers of drink. With steady hands, she poured the bitter powder into the bowls, stirred it into the sauces, let it dissolve into the wine. Each act was a prayer, each drop a hymn of vengeance. The enslaved cooks exchanged fearful glances, but Sarah's voice cut through their dread. Tonight, we dine on freedom. When the overseers raised their cups, Sarah stood at the doorway watching. Their laughter turned to coughing. Their boasts became groans. One by one, they clutched at their throats, their faces twisting with pain. Some fell to the ground, writhing. Others staggered, reaching for weapons they could not hold. The feast became a grave, but the poison was only the beginning. Outside, the fields erupted with fire as torches were thrown into barns and haystacks. The air filled with smoke and the screams of startled animals. Enslaved men charged the cabins of drunken overseers who had not yet joined the feast. Doors were broken down, throats slit, blood soaking into wooden floors. The sound of chains snapping was drowned by the roar of flames. Sarah herself led the storming of the great house. She carried no gun, only a kitchen knife, her face streaked with sweat and soot. The survivors of the poisoned feast stumbled through the halls, desperate to escape. But the slaves cut them down one by one. The house, once a monument of cruelty, shook with the thunder of rebellion. In the chaos, Sarah climbed the staircase, the knife in her hand dripping red. At the top, she looked back at her people. Men and women who had been beaten, whipped, sold, humiliated. Tonight, they were not slaves. Tonight, they were warriors. With a cry that seemed to tear centuries apart, she shouted, "Burn it all! Leave nothing standing!" And so the fire consumed everything. The house, the ledgers of ownership, the very memory of the masters who once ruled. The flames lit the Georgia sky like dawn itself, but this dawn was not of peace. It was of war. The uprising had begun, and the world would never forget it. The plantation stood in silence. Its fields, once alive with forced labor and overseers' whips, had been swallowed by weeds and creeping vines. The great house, once the symbol of power and cruelty, was nothing but a blackened skeleton of charred wood. The uprising of 1848 had not only destroyed overseers and masters, but had also marked the land itself with the scars of rebellion. Sarah stood at the edge of the ruined field, her face hardened by the years that had passed since the Thanksgiving night of fire and poison. She was older now, her body lined with exhaustion, but her spirit remained unbroken. The memory of the feast, the sight of overseers gasping on the floor, and the fire that licked the heavens replayed in her mind like scripture. It was the night she became legend, the name whispered by slaves across Georgia and beyond. But freedom had not been simple. After the uprising, patrols hunted her and the survivors like animals. Many were caught, hung from trees as warnings. Yet Sarah, with cunning born of fire, disappeared into the marshes and woods, leading bands of fugitives towards safe havens. She became more than a woman. She became a shadow, a ghostly presence, a symbol. Some said she fled north through secret routes where abolitionists sheltered her. Others claimed she took refuge among the Maroons deep in the swamps, where white men feared to tread. A few whispered that Sarah still roamed Georgia, masked in the night, striking down those who raised a whip. Whether fact or legend, her name carried the weight of resistance. Years later, the Civil War would shatter the chains of millions. Soldiers and generals marched, but the seeds of rebellion had been sown long before, by the enslaved themselves, by Sarah. Around campfires, escaped slaves spoke of her as a prophetess of freedom. In northern newspapers, abolitionists printed stories of the slave woman of Georgia who poisoned her overseers, and in the hushed prayers of the enslaved, Sarah was remembered as the one who proved that even the most powerless could strike terror into the hearts of tyrants. As the war ended and freedom was proclaimed, the ruins of the plantation remained untouched, a monument of ashes. Children born free would ask, "What happened here?" And elders would answer, "This is where Sarah set the chains on fire." The wind carried the whispers. Sarah's story was not just about vengeance. It was about defiance, about daring to resist when resistance meant certain death. She had not lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, nor the 13th Amendment, but her fire had burned a path toward it. In the end, Sarah was no longer just a woman. She was a legacy, a chain broken, a flame eternal.